Democracy, dictatorship, monarchy, governments come in many forms. In this video, we'll explore words that describe different types of government and their rules. With definitions, examples, and images, let's understand the language of governance. Gynocracy as noun. A society or system of governance in which women hold the dominant positions of power. Gynocracy challenges traditional patriarchal norms and structures by prioritizing female leadership and perspectives. Some historical societies, such as the Amazons of Greek mythology, are depicted as practicing gynocracy. The utopian society envisioned by the feminist author was a gynocracy where women had equal representation and authority in all aspects of life. Critics of gynocracy argue that it may marginalize men and perpetuate gender-based discrimination in reverse. In the fictional world of the novel, the gynocracy had abolished traditional gender roles, with women occupying leadership roles in government, business, and the military. Idiocracy as noun. A form of government in which the least qualified citizens govern or have the most power, ruled by idiots or the ignorant. A society characterized by a lack of intelligence, wisdom, or sound judgment, often resulting from complacency or a decline in intellectual standards. The rise of anti-intellectualism in public discourse is seen as a troubling sign of impending idiocracy. The professor warned against the dangers of complacency leading to an idiocracy in academia. The collapse of the empire was attributed to the rise of idiocracy among its leaders. Some critics argue that the current political climate resembles the beginnings of an idiocracy. The dystopian film depicted a future society descending into idiocracy, where intelligence was scorned and ignorance prevailed. Polyarchy is noun. A form of government or political system in which power is vested in multiple individuals or groups, often characterized by competitive elections, political pluralism, and the existence of multiple centers of authority. A system of governance that allows for the participation of diverse social and political groups in decision-making processes, typically with mechanisms for peaceful transfer of power and protection of individual rights. In a polyarchy, citizens have the opportunity to participate in the political process through voting, advocacy, and involvement in civil society organizations. Polyarchy is often contrasted with autocracy, where power is concentrated in the hands of a single ruler or governing elite. Polyarchy promotes the idea that political power should be dispersed among various social and political actors to prevent the concentration of power and protect individual liberties. Many modern democracies are considered examples of polyarchy, as they feature competitive elections, multiple political parties, and checks and balances on governmental power. The concept of polyarchy emphasizes the importance of political pluralism and the inclusion of diverse voices and perspectives in the governance process. Mobocracy as noun. A situation in which the actions or decisions of a large group or mob prevail over those of elected officials or established authorities. Rule or control by a mob. A system of government or governance characterized by mob rule. In a mobocracy, individual rights and freedoms may be disregarded in favor of the will of the crowd. The historian studied instances of mobocracy throughout history, examining the factors that led to its emergence. The philosopher warned of the dangers of mobocracy, advocating for democratic principles and the rule of law. The country descended into mobocracy as protests turned violent and lawlessness prevailed. The leader's rise to power was fueled by appeals to populism and the desire to overturn what he called the elitist rule of democracy, ultimately leading to a state of mobocracy. Snobocracy is noun. A form of governance or leadership characterized by snobbery, exclusivity, and favoritism towards the upper class. a social system or hierarchy in which power and influence are held by a privileged class of snobbish or elitist individuals. The monarchy was seen as a symbol of the snobocracy, with nobles enjoying lavish lifestyles while the common people suffered. The company's management team formed a snobocracy, with promotions and perks reserved for those in the inner circle. The country was ruled by a snobocracy, where only the wealthy elite had a say in political affairs. Despite claims of democracy, the nation was essentially controlled by a snobocracy of old money families. The school's administration operated as a snobocracy, showing favoritism towards students from affluent families. Democracy as noun. A state governed by democracy. A system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. Democracy promotes political equality and participation among its citizens. The United States is often referred to as a democracy, where citizens elect their leaders through voting. Ancient Greece is credited with laying the foundations of democracy, with Athens being one of the earliest democracies. The principles of democracy include freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the right to vote. Many countries around the world have transitioned from authoritarian rule to democracy in recent decades. Autocracy as noun. A system of government in which supreme power is concentrated in the hands of one individual or a small group, with little or no input from citizens. Absolute or unlimited power or authority vested in a single ruler or authority figure. The king's autocracy stifled dissent and suppressed political opposition. The overthrow of the autocracy led to the establishment of a democratic government. The country was ruled by an autocracy for decades, with the leader holding absolute power over the state. Citizens protested against the autocracy's oppressive policies and lack of political freedoms. The autocracy's control over the media ensured that only propaganda supporting the regime was disseminated. Panacocracy as noun. A theoretical or idealized form of governance characterized by equal participation and shared decision-making among all members of a community, often associated with principles of social justice and egalitarianism. A utopian social and political system proposed by the Romantic poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, envisioning a society based on equality and democracy, with communal ownership of property and governance by all members. Some scholars argue that elements of panacocracy can be found in modern communal living arrangements and cooperative societies. Coleridge and Southey's vision of a panacocracy aimed to create a society free from class distinctions and hierarchical structures. The concept of panacocracy continues to inspire discussions about alternative forms of governance and social organization. Despite its appeal as an ideal, the practical implementation of panacocracy faced challenges due to logistical and ideological complexities. The panacocratic ideals promoted by the Romantic poets influenced utopian movements and communal experiments in the 19th century. Monocracy is noun. A form of government in which supreme authority is vested in a single individual or ruler. A system of governance characterized by the rule or domination of a single person or group. Throughout history, tyrants and dictators have imposed monocracies on their people through force and coercion. Some argue that corporate interests have led to a de facto monocracy in certain industries. The ancient kingdom was governed by a monocracy, with absolute power vested in the king. The dystopian novel depicts a future society ruled by a ruthless monocracy that suppresses dissent. The rise of authoritarian leaders in recent years has raised concerns about the erosion of democracy and the emergence of monocracies. Hagiocracy is noun. A government or society ruled by saints, holy persons, or religious leaders. Theocracy and hagiocracy are sometimes used interchangeably, although they may have different implications regarding governance and religious authority. In the fictional novel, the author imagines a utopian society governed by a hagiocracy where the highest moral standards are upheld. Critics argue that hagiocracy can lead to intolerance and oppression, as those in power may impose their religious beliefs on others. The concept of hagiocracy raises questions about the separation of church and state and the balance of religious and secular authority. Some historical accounts depict periods of hagiocracy where religious figures held significant political power. Bureaucracy is noun. A system of administration characterized by hierarchical structure, formalized rules and procedures, and rigid adherence to protocols. The complex network of government officials and departments responsible for implementing and managing laws, regulations, and policies. The bureaucracy of the education system can sometimes impede teachers' ability to adapt and innovate in the classroom. Navigating through the bureaucracy of obtaining a business permit can be a daunting task for entrepreneurs. Many citizens feel frustrated by the bureaucracy of the healthcare system, which can make accessing medical care difficult. The company's bureaucracy often led to delays in decision-making and hindered innovation. Despite efforts to streamline bureaucracy, government agencies often face criticism for inefficiency and red tape. Aristocracy as noun. A privileged, wealthy, or powerful ruling class perceived as superior to the rest of society. The highest class in certain societies, especially those holding hereditary titles or offices. The aristocracy of wealth controls a disproportionate amount of resources and political power. Some argue that meritocracy is preferable to aristocracy, as it rewards talent and effort rather than birthright. The French Revolution aimed to overthrow the aristocracy and establish a more egalitarian society. In ancient Greece, the aristocracy wielded significant political and social influence. The British aristocracy includes nobles with titles such as Duke, Earl, and Baron. Ochlocracy as noun. A form of government characterized by mob rule or the rule of the masses. A system of governance in which power is held by a mob or unruly crowd. A state of disorder, chaos, or anarchy resulting from the actions or influence of a volatile or unruly mob. In times of crisis, leaders must guard against the dangers of ochlocracy and uphold the rule of law. The ancient city-state descended into ochlocracy as rioting mobs seized control of the streets. Some historians argue that the French Revolution devolved into ochlocracy during its most chaotic phases. The dictator exploited the fears and grievances of the populace to maintain power, leading the country into a state of ochlocracy. Social media platforms have the potential to amplify the voices of the masses, but also pose risks of fostering ochlocracy through misinformation and incitement. Theocracy is noun. A form of government in which religious leaders or institutions hold political power. A system of governance in which divine guidance or religious law is considered supreme. Ancient Egypt was ruled by a theocracy, with the pharaoh serving as both a political and religious leader. Iran is considered a theocratic state, with clerics holding significant influence over government affairs. The concept of theocracy raises questions about the separation of church and state and the balance of power within society. Some argue that certain periods of history, such as the Middle Ages, were characterized by theocracy. Theocracy was prevalent in medieval Europe, where the church wielded considerable power over kings and emperors. Statocracy is noun. A form of government in which the state exercises substantial control over political and economic affairs, often to the detriment of individual liberties or democratic principles. A political system characterized by a strong centralized authority or bureaucracy that dominates decision-making and governance. The rise of statocracy in the region sparked protests and calls for democratic reforms. The party's platform advocated for a reduction in government intervention and a move away from statocracy toward greater individual autonomy. In a statocracy, power is concentrated in the hands of a few government officials who wield significant control over the population. The regime's authoritarian rule led to accusations of statocracy, as political dissent was suppressed and civil liberties were restricted. Critics argue that the country's transition from democracy to statocracy threatens the rights and freedoms of its citizens. Kakistocracy as noun. A state or society governed by the least suitable or competent people. Government by the least qualified or most unprincipled citizens. Critics argued that the administration's policies reflected the characteristics of a kakistocracy, prioritizing personal gain over public welfare. The rise of kakistocracy led to widespread disillusionment among the populace, eroding trust in democratic institutions. The country's descent into kakistocracy was marked by rampant corruption and incompetence in government. The political upheaval resulted in the establishment of a kakistocracy, with power concentrated in the hands of a small, corrupt elite. The nation's descent into kakistocracy was viewed as a regression from the principles of good governance and meritocracy. Gerontocracy as noun. A form of social organization or political system in which power and authority are held by elderly individuals, typically based on age and seniority. A society or government dominated or ruled by elderly people, often characterized by policies and practices that prioritize the interests of the elderly over those of younger generations. The ruling party's leadership resembled a gerontocracy, with most members being elderly and resistant to change. The country's gerontocracy was criticized for its failure to address the needs and concerns of younger citizens. Despite its reputation as a gerontocracy, the society valued the wisdom and experience of its elders in guiding social and political affairs. In some traditional societies, gerontocracy was the norm, with decision-making authority vested in the elders of the community. The rise of gerontocracy in the government led to calls for generational change and greater representation of younger voices. Timocracy as noun. A form of government in which political power is vested in those who possess a certain amount of property or wealth. A political system in which honors or offices are distributed according to merit or virtue. Some theorists argue that a true meritocracy is an idealized form of timocracy, where individuals rise to power based on their abilities and contributions to society. Ancient Athens is often cited as an example of a timocracy, where citizenship and political rights were granted based on property ownership. The concept of timocracy raises questions about the fairness and inclusivity of political systems based on wealth or merit. In a timocracy, the ruling class may be comprised of wealthy landowners or successful entrepreneurs. Plato discussed the concept of timocracy in his work The Republic, considering its advantages and drawbacks compared to other forms of government. Plutocracy as noun. A form of government or society in which power is concentrated in the hands of a wealthy ruling class or elite group, typically characterized by the influence of wealth and economic privilege in shaping government policies and decisions. A social system or structure in which economic power and control are held by a small minority of wealthy individuals or families, often to the detriment of the broader population. Critics argue that the country is moving towards a plutocracy, where political influence is increasingly determined by economic wealth. The protesters called for an end to plutocracy and the implementation of policies that prioritize the needs of ordinary citizens over the interests of the wealthy elite. In a plutocracy, economic inequality tends to be high, with the wealthiest individuals wielding disproportionate power and influence. The rise of corporate lobbying has led to accusations of plutocracy, with powerful corporations exerting undue influence over government policies. The political system was dominated by a plutocracy of wealthy landowners and industrialists. Hierarchy is noun, a form of government or rule in which religious authorities hold supreme power or influence. Government or administration by ecclesiastical authorities or religious leaders. The concept of a hierarchy is antithetical to the principles of secularism and the separation of church and state. The transition from a hierarchy to a secular government marked a significant turning point in the country's history, leading to greater political freedom and autonomy. Theocratic regimes can be considered hierarchies, as religious doctrine shapes government policy and decision-making. In medieval Europe, the church wielded considerable political power, leading to a hierarchy where religious leaders held sway over secular affairs. Some ancient civilizations, such as Egypt, were governed by hierarchies where the ruling class comprised priests and religious figures. Level up your English. Master vocabulary, idioms, and phrasal verbs with fun quizzes. Translate meanings into 104 languages. Download now. Link in the description. Please like and subscribe to our channel.